Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the second in this series of webinars from Maxymiser. This afternoon's webinar is on delivering effective online personalization strategies to drive revenue growth. For those of you unfamiliar with Maxymiser, Maxymiser was founded in 2006, and since then our entire focus has been on customer experience optimization. We don't provide solutions in any other areas at all, purely focus on that, and over that 8-year period we've gained over 300 enterprise level clients who just use us for that optimization process. And I think one of the reasons that we've been so successful at doing that is because of the amount of money that we invest in R&D and development, both of the platform behind this in terms of being able to serve personalization into a browser session quickly and seamlessly, but also in the tools that people can use to drive this themselves and be able to build these personalization strategies without an army of technical people behind us. And I think you can see from the awards on the slide here how successful we've been at that. Before we get started though, I think we just talk about where does personalization fit into all of this? So from Maxymiser's point of view, customer experience optimization is about providing an optimized experience to people visiting your website or your apps on mobile devices. And personalization is really just a part of that. But I think what we'll see as we go through today is that without these two other pieces, without the testing and the insight component in there too, we'd never really be able to drive personalization effectively. We need the insight piece to understand where to get started, what to personalize and whether it's working or not. And we need to have testing as a method for trying out different personalization techniques to find out which of those are working for us and which of those are generating the ROI and the revenue that we need out of the website that we have here. So let's take a look at why do we personalize. What's the purpose of all of this? Why are we here? Well, there are 3 reasons I think why we do this. The first one is that we want to get a larger percentage of visitors to transact. So transact here could be buy something, or it could be search for a brochure, or look for a holiday, or get some inspiration around flights, or play a game on a gaming site, or apply for a product on a financial services site. So it doesn't have to be a retail focused transaction. It's just somebody engaging with the site. We want to get more people to interact with the site that we have. And the reason we might personalize there is because different people have different requirements, different people are looking for different services. Maybe by providing a more relevant process to somebody, we can allow that person to perform that task more easily. And then the second piece then is, once we have people transacting with us, is to get them to transact more often. So building loyalty, making sure people come back to the site. And that's a very similar story. That's about providing a relevant experience, providing content to people that makes them engage with the site and makes them want to come back and visit again because they felt they were able to fulfill the task that they were trying to do. And then the third one is getting those people to either spend more or interact more each time they're on the site transacting with us. So it might be buy more product, it might be consume more media, play more games, search for more hotels or more flights, or whatever the purpose of the website is. And it's really those 3 things together. We need to think about how can we personalize the whole experience in all of those aspects, which is where we need to be to get the maximum revenue out of the site. So what do we mean by personalization in this context? Well, I mean, it says it here really, find and serve the best experience for each segment and ideally for each visitor. Quite often we don't know who a visitor is because they're browsing the website anonymously, so segments are perhaps the best we can do on an initial pass, but the principle is pretty simple. We've got different kinds of content, different kinds of journeys, different kinds of messaging. We want to make sure we show the right content to the right people, which sounds pretty simple, but anyone who's tried to do this in practice knows that actually it's not quite as straightforward as it sounds. And there are some things we need to have in place before we can really get started and do this effectively. So the first one is looking at identify the best opportunities for personalization. Use insight to figure out where should we get started. Where is the best ROI to be had for personalization? Where's the best place to look? It's not always going to be the home page. Lots of people think about homepage banners or targeting people on landing pages. Sometimes the best place to start is further down the funnel and look more at the funnel process rather than focusing on actual kind of landing pages. So we need to consider, where do we need to be personalizing to get this to work effectively. Also, what segments do we want to target? So once we know where to look, what groups of people do we have? What groups of people do we need to create content for? What groups of people do we need to start serving different experiences to? So we need to understand that, and also we need to be able to do this without having to be rocket scientists and do lots of manual data mining. And so, there's a reasonable amount of insight required before we can get started to really understand how to do this properly and where we should be looking. So I think looking at those 3 points step by step. So the first one, where should I personalize? There's lots of different opinions here, I think, in terms of where is the best place to start on a site, and although we talk about everything we do here being data driven, I think there is still opinion and gut feel in personalization, particularly up front when we really don't know what it is we're trying to do. And sometimes gut feel is the best approach. If you have a new product or a new area of the site, and you have to use your experience and your market knowledge to know what you think might work for targeting people. You don't always have the luxury of the data, so you shouldn't discount gut feel. It's a very valid starting point, and we should always consider that. And we're going to obviously use the tools we talked about before, the insight and the testing, in conjunction with the personalization to measure the effectiveness of everything we do. So even if we do start with gut feel, we're going to check that out, and we're going to measure that, and we're going to have scientific proof as to whether that is true or not true. But good starting point, as are all the other things on here. So any segments you might have identified offline, maybe in a CRM system, any other analytics data. There might be some external events going on outside the company or even inside the company. You're launching a product, your competitors are launching a product, so maybe there's something you need to put up on the site which you need to personalize the content for people based on that, or personas you've developed, or indeed just corporate objectives as to what you're trying to get out of the website. These are all valid starting points and places to look at for where should I start, or how should I get started with personalization. I think the next step after that then is looking at, well, okay, that's great, but what segments of people do I have, and who can I target? Again, there are several different layers to this. So there's tools out there which will help you get understanding of how people are interacting with the website. But even before you start applying any personalization or any testing or anything to the site, you can get an idea of who's on your site and what are they doing. And Maxymiser has some tools to help you with that. So pre-test or pre-personalization, we have some segment discovery tools which allow you to look at the profile of people visiting your website and help you to understand what kind of people is the site working well for, what kind of people is the site not working so well for, or any clusters of people that have a problem with the process or can't perform the task they're trying to do. All these are candidates for not just where to start, but who should I start with and what kind of segments should I look for. And then of course we have analysis we can do after we've collected data around personalization and testing. So if we're running some personalization campaigns on the homepage, or indeed during a funnel process, once those campaigns are up and running, we can start to analyze the data, and we can find maybe additional segments or additional clusters of people that are behaving differently in those areas, which will help us to refine our personalization process as we go forward. So a key question here, I think, is where do you get data from to support all of this? So we're talking very much here about building a profile of a visitor and using data to drive segments. So where do we get that from? Well, I think there are really three main areas where we get visitor profile data from. First one is from the session itself. So we're working in the user's browser or in the user's app if we're talking about app personalization. So we've got lots of information around the type of device somebody's using, the platform they're on, where are they, how did they get here. There's a lot more web information here, sort of traffic source, did somebody come to search or a referrer or to the brand URL, what are they doing with the device and with that sort of route to the site. So that we can collect all that information for free. There's also information then that we collect from the interaction itself. So when someone's on the site, maybe we look at the categories of pages that somebody browses. Are they looking at shoes or coats, or are they looking at male products or female products, or are they looking at vacations or business trips? All those kind of things we can pick up by what people are looking at and what data people are entering into forms. Particularly things like insurance quote processes. If anybody works in that sort of financial services industry, by the time someone's made it through a quote process, you know quite a lot about them, even though you don't know who that person is yet, because they're still probably anonymous and not logged in, but you know a lot about them, and you can use that data to help drive the process from then on in and make sure that you serve people content which is relevant to the task they're trying to do. And then finally, if you do have a login ID or you do have people that you can identify, then there's lots of other data we can bring in. So sort of CRM feed, if you've got a CRM system that can provide you with data, someone's an existing customer, we can bring segmentation data out of that. We can take segments from the existing analytics tools, we can hook into data management platforms, or indeed other data aggregators which might be on the site. So tools like Insighton or Telium maybe that are building a visitor profile already, we can maybe take some of that information on board and use that. It's all important, all information that we can gather, but I think we need to understand that there are different categories of information here, and as I said, a lot of people are browsing sites anonymously, and you have to figure out how to provide personalization to those anonymous visitors. So maybe the third category there is harder to achieve, but certainly the primary driver here is going to be the first two, so session information and interaction information. And I think one of the things that we really need to look at is that interaction data that we collect and the context of the interaction, and using contextual data to drive personalization. Just the example I have here is an airline search form where someone is searching for a flight. It's the same search form, it's potentially even the same person, they're just interacting with this form in different ways, which is indicative of their intent. Just to help you out here, the differences are that one person is booking a 2-week holiday and they've got children in the booking, the other person is booking a 1-day trip and they've only got one adult in the booking. So maybe we can make an assumption here that one of these people is booking a leisure trip and one of these people is booking a business trip. We collect that from the context of the interaction. I have no idea who this person is, they don't even need to be logged in. I'm just assuming that that's what they're trying to do, and so why then do I force this person or these people through exactly the same booking process when they probably have a different set of requirements? The people with children will need baggage and bags in the hold, and they'll probably want to be seated together, whereas the business traveller probably just wants to get off the plane as soon as they possibly can, so maybe seating at the front. And maybe other airport ancillary services, maybe car hire is more important to them than baggage in the hold. So we can use the information we capture out of the form here to then drive more relevant, more personalised experiences to the person, just to make that process easier and more relevant. And that goes back, I think, to the first thing we talked about, the 3 different kinds of personalisation. If you want people to reuse your site and build loyalty, then providing people with a relevant experience which makes it easy to perform the task is a great way to do that, and contextual data will really help you with that. So that's great, but we still need to think about all the other segments we've got out there and all the other things we've identified by looking at the analytics and maybe even the gut feel thing. In order to support that, we will need some data from somewhere in order to target those people. So for each of the segments we're thinking about, we have to think about what data do we need to be able to do that. We have to think about where are we going to get that data from. So are the necessary data feeds in place to be able to collect all of that? Do you need to set anything else up before you can start doing any of this personalization work? So you've got to think about that, and then you've got to think about the rules for some of these data items. So the simple example I gave there of business versus leisure, we need a definition of what's a business traveller and what's a leisure traveller, so that we can be clear when we come to do the content serving and do the measurement that we're all talking the same language, and that we really understand kind of where the boundaries of that segment are. At what point does somebody stop being a business traveller and start being a single vacation person? So we need to understand what that is, and that's got to be documented and defined so that we can use that appropriately. Now what we see in our experience of working in the industry is that different verticals have different data sets, and not everyone obviously has exactly the same kind of customer, so there are some standard attributes that we might pick out. Financial services have a different set of criteria maybe for retail. So one of the exercises you need to go through when you're thinking about putting together any kind of personalization strategy is what's relevant to you as an organization. What's going to work for you doesn't necessarily work for someone else, so you need to spend some time thinking about not just what data can you collect, but also what things do you think might be important and what data might you want to be able to use, so you can think about getting all the relevant data feeds and things in place. So once we have all that, so we know where we're going to start, we've got all the data set up, we know what segments we're talking about. The act of personalization itself really then also has many layers on top of that. As it says here, it's a complex matching game. It's about taking an individual or a group of individuals who are on your website and matching them with the right content to get them to convert more or buy more or be a higher value customer or whatever the objective is here. So it's about taking those segments of people and matching them with relevant content. Now there are a couple of different ways we can do that. I guess the most simple one, and the one that most people seem to be using, is rules-based targeting. So we just build a definition for these segments. So if someone's in that age range, we classify them as a young visitor and we show them a particular piece of content. If they're in London, we think they're an urban visitor, so we show them something relevant. Otherwise, there's some default content that we show to everyone else. We are building some rules. We're building a hypothesis here to say, I think if I serve a different content to this particular segment of people, then I'll get an increase in conversion. So we set up some personalization, we start testing that, we start measuring the performance of that, and we find out whether that works or not. And at one level that may work, but that's quite simple view. Quite often it's more complicated than that. And people move segments as well as they go around the site. People don't always behave the same way. I think that airline example is a really good one because it might be the same person in the same session booking those two trips, and I might switch context midway through, and when I start off behaving like a business traveler but I end up behaving like a leisure traveler. So in this example here, if somebody is in their age range, they are likely to be a young visitor, and if their average purchase is less than $25 for the last 3 purchases, then maybe we continue to think of them as a young visitor, but maybe we decrease the likelihood of them being a young visitor if they buy things which we don't consider to be typical products for young visitors to buy. So if someone buys patio furniture, then maybe we decrease the likelihood that we think that they're a young visitor. Similarly, if we're going for this idea of an urban visitor, somebody's always visiting the site from a tablet, then maybe that shows a sort of sign of more affluence, so maybe that increases the likelihood of that being true. But if they do tend to buy kind of outdoor garden appliances and things, then maybe that reduces the likelihood of them being properly classified as an urban visitor. So there's some complication around here about evolving the rules and changing things over time and making sure that we're not forcing people into a bucket for their whole duration when they might change as they go through. And then ultimately we have this concept of algorithmic matching, where kind of throw away the rules and we just use the technology to analyze the data and to automatically learn what content to serve to which people. So we do this by continually measuring, continually monitoring the content that we're serving and what people are responding to, and allow the machine effectively to build up an idea of what content we should serve to which visitor based on how people are interacting. And if we look at all those different techniques, I think they're all relevant, and it depends on where you're working, but the complexity of this changes which technique we need to use. So if you're looking at fairly simple one attribute type of things where it doesn't change very often, then rules is a good approach for that. So and lots of people use rules very effectively. So an example of that might be if I'm on the English version of the website, then you serve me content around that. I mean, that's a pretty fixed rule, and it's not likely to change. So I can be sure that works. What happens though, as we kind of go up the hierarchy here, the more attributes we have, the more complex the rules get, the harder it gets to test those and verify that they're working properly, and then the more frequently they change as well, that gets even more complicated and more harder. So what we're thinking of doing here is that once you get to the sort of outside of rules, where rules aren't really working for you anymore, is we need to move into this more of this sort of affinity formula kind of model, where we have a framework and we're adjusting our idea of what segment people fit into based on how they're interacting and taking that contextual information into account. And then finally, when we get to the top, where we have literally hundreds of attributes, even this idea of kind of guided affinity formulas really doesn't work in that sort of scale, because there's just too much data to take into account. Quite often the problem with that is that we don't know what data is relevant, so we need this idea of a machine learning engine to help us identify what the right thing to do is and the right content to serve to the right person. So what we see in reality is that personalization is a complex environment here, where there's lots of data coming in from all sorts of different sources. We're bringing all the data together, we're having the hundreds of attributes in total, and we're trying to then take all that data and figure out what content to serve to people. And the outcome obviously we're looking for increased ROI or increased engagement or increased in revenue, or whatever the measure is we're looking at on whatever device that person is on. And it's that process process of this sort of matching everything together, bringing everything together, where you need a combination of all of those techniques we've talked about all in one place to be able to do this effectively. So what we see from those 300 enterprise clients that we currently work with is that pretty much all of them are running personalization campaigns on their website through Maxymiser technology, whether they're using simple rules because they're just starting or in the process of collecting more data, or whether they're using more of the algorithmic methods. Really depends on how sophisticated they are, how rich their data platform is, and how advanced they are. But everyone is trying to get to that idea of having a much more advanced personalization strategy, and really we see that because people are testing and personalizing content not just on single pages but actually throughout a funnel process. So if somebody's going through a complex booking process, we want to make sure that not just is the messaging relevant through all the stages, but that potentially we can be having a scenario where we are adapting different stages of the funnel based on what we know about people. So what we're really doing here is we're actually combining personalization with MVT and saying that we're delivering people with custom journeys based on the data that we know about them and this algorithmic learning and all these attributes we have in place, so that the experience somebody gets is truly dynamic. And obviously measurement is key to this. If we're going through the whole process of adapting a journey and delivering dynamic content on multiple pages, we've got to be able to measure that effectively and really understand what difference that's making. As at the end of the day, this is only worth doing if it increases revenue or benefits your business in some way, and you don't really want to have to go through the complexities of setting this up just to find that it doesn't make a difference. So this is really where the testing piece comes into this, is to say that while we can do all of this, we've got to make sure that we're measuring that and that we are testing that and that we are continually refining what we're doing based on the insight we get from that. So in order to be able to do all this properly, we've got to have a platform that supports all of those disciplines. So even though we're focusing on personalization, I think it's pretty clear that without testing and without insight, we're never really going to be able to know what's going on with personalization. We're never really going to be able to start an effective personalization strategy without having those other bits in place. So they are really key components to have there. And also we've got to have the other bits on the other end of this platform. So channels, you've got to be able to do this not just on the desktop. You've got to be able to do this through mobile and tablet as one consistent experience. You need to be able to do this on apps. You've got to be able to connect this to the other activities that are going on. So it needs to be joined up with your CRM platform. You've got to have cross-channel consistency here, and that needs integration. So we've got to be able to integrate them with other tools in the environment to help us not just collect data and pump data around, but also to join up experiences across those things. Particularly people who are working in regulated environments where there are maybe session capture tools involved, so something like Session Cam. So where we're working in an environment where we're serving personalized content into a channel, and that session is being captured for compliance purposes, we've got to make sure that that tool is capturing the personalization layer and not just the default web content which was provided by the server. So there's also integration required into all these other areas of the site to bring all this together into one place. So I'm just going to switch gears a little bit here now and switch over to showing you some of this stuff in action. So I'm just going to switch over to the Maxymiser demo here and show you how this looks for real. Okay, so the first thing I need to do to get started here is to log in to the portal. So I'll just log in here. Okay, so this is the main Maxymiser dashboard where we see all of the personalization and all the testing activity that's going on here. You can see a couple of other people also building webinar tests here too. So this is the starting point where I start with everything, all of the insight, all of the analytics, and all of the personalization building happens from within this dashboard. However, the first thing I want to look at before I get started here is some reporting. I don't want to launch straight in and build a test without getting a bit of insight first of all. So I'm just going to navigate to some other bits of the site here to find some interesting data about what's going on. And I've got a couple of different reports here monitoring a couple of different areas of my site. I just want to look at one of these to start with. And what this report is going to show me, it's going to tell me whether I've got any segments of people accessing my site which are behaving maybe in a slightly different way to the average, or whether there are any areas of the site which are working or not working for various different kinds of visitors. So I can see at a glance here actually that this particular report is looking at from a cart page to a purchase confirmation page, and already I can see very clearly from here that this is working very well for people on a desktop site, but probably not so well for people who are using iOS and Safari browsers on a tablet. So I could make an assumption here that this company has a different mobile site or a responsive site that serves in a different way for mobile. So this is particularly people trying to use the desktop site on a tablet who are having issues. There's lots of data that I've collected here as part of the process. So any of the data that we collect, even though we're not serving any test content or anything just yet, will be considered in this, and any interesting segments or any difference in user behavior will be highlighted in this report. And this is a great way, one of the things I was talking about before, is a great way to help me get started and figure out where I should be personalizing and maybe where are the areas I should be focusing on to get started. So I'm going to go back to my dashboard now, and what I want to do now that I've got a bit of insight into what's going in is I want to create some personalization information here to start putting targeted content on the homepage of my website. So the website I'm going to look at here is this one here, conversioninteriors.com, which is a Maxymiser website which we use for testing and demonstration purposes. So this is the site. It's a retail site. It's got some rotating carousel banners on the homepage here, which are just sort of hoping that I say something interesting as that goes past, and then a few offers and things going on here. So what I'm going to look at doing is replacing this rotating carousel here with maybe some targeted content based on what we know about the user behavior. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new test or some new personalization, which I'm then going to test on the site here. So now I've started the visual tool, and there are a couple of things I just need to think about before I get started here. The first one is what kind of thing am I doing here? Am I building a simple personalization which is just effectively A/B personalization, or am I trying to build maybe some more complex multivariate personalization? I think for the purposes of this today I'll just stick with A/B. I've also got to decide what's the target device for the personalization campaign that I'm building. Is it desktop or is it tablet or mobile here? Again, for the purposes of today's webinar, I'm going to stick with desktop. The next webinar in the series is about mobile and app testing, so we'll focus more on those kind of topics in that webinar. For now though, just going to keep it simple. In the spirit of keeping it simple, I'm going to open one that I built before. So the idea of the tool here is it's taking me through a guided process and helping me to build a personalization layer on top of my existing website. So the process here is to start with pages. So I'm going to, where am I working? In this case I'm working on the home page of the website, so I've just navigated to where I need to be, and I've added that to the personalization campaign that I'm building here. The important step here is the content. So it's what am I doing and what am I going to change? So this is the original home page that's got as I say, got that carousel on it, and what I want to do is I want to create a couple of different versions of the page here. I've already got one that I built for lamps, which replaces some of that content with a static banner or a slightly different layout. So I've already got a version of a personalization layer here for lamps. I'm going to create a new one here for tables. So let me create a new one here. So the first thing I need to do here is to figure out where I'm going to put my new content. And what I want to do here actually is I want to get rid of this carousel that's in here, so I'm going to physically delete the carousel from the page, and then I'm going to take this area here above these existing images here, and I'm going to insert a new banner into this area of the page. I want to insert something above there. I've got my creative guys have already built my banner for me and put it in the content management platform, so I can just insert that into the page. That's not quite in the right place, so I just used my keyboard here to nudge that up a bit. There we go, and obviously when I do that I will set up the links and connect that to somewhere for people to go to actually get to see tables. So that's me creating the content there for that personalization layer. As you can see from the context menu there's lots of other things we can do to the page here, not just adding content in. We can be editing things, moving things around, changing copy. So there's lots we can do with this in terms of personalization, and it doesn't just have to be a single page either. We can be doing more complex multi-page testing here, as we discussed earlier on, maybe changing the whole whole part of a process, or building an MBT test, which is actually personalization throughout a whole journey. But for today, this is just a simple banner, homepage banner targeting kind of test. So I've created my different version there. I've now got one for lamps and one for tables. I'll just save that. The next thing I need to do is figure out who I'm going to show that to. So I've got various different kinds of rules set up here. So the first one you can see here is that for the whole personalization campaign, I have an inclusion rule which says this campaign won't get triggered unless this condition is met. And since I'm personalizing the homepage here based on the category of the product that you last looked at, it's only valid for returning visitors because they're the only people that I have that data for. So I'm going to say this test only runs if you're a returning visitor. I already have something set up for lamps, but I'll show you the process I went through by creating one here for the tables. So when we have Maxymiser running on the site, we're collecting all the data that we discussed in the presentation. It's all exposed here in the tool. We can go and choose any of those attributes that we've collected. So here I can just say if the last category of product I looked at was tables, so I'll add that to the rule. So if this person is looking at or last looked at tables, then when they come back to the site, I want to show them the tables variant that I've just created. I'm just going to rename this as table, make it more sensible and easy to understand. So I do that. So now I have two rules here. I have one for lamps that says if the last category someone looked at was lamps, show them lamps. If the last category someone looked at was tables, show them tables. If they looked at something different, then they're going to get to see the default experience, which is the original carousel with all of those changes, all of those rotating banners in it. So now I've set up the content and I've set up the rules for how people get targeted with that. The next thing I need to do is to give that a QA or a check before I publish that live. I need to make sure that all of the links are working and that all of the content is working appropriately in there before that gets published. So over here on the content step, we had the ability to preview these, so we can get a preview URL to get that content to be shown live. So I can email this URL to someone who is not necessarily a Maxymiser user, who can then force that particular version of the personalization to be shown, so they can then test all the links to make sure all the links are working properly. So once that's all been tested, we go through the publish process. Now normally we would separate that out into different roles so that people who have permission to build the tests don't have permission to publish. So the publish step would normally be separate. In this case, because it's a demonstration, I do have the ability to publish that, but normally we would just get to the step here where we would notify the next person in the process, say email my manager and say, hey, I'm trying to put this personalization campaign together, can you check it out please before publishing it live. Obviously once that is live, then we start to see data being collected and we start to see reporting happening, and we can start to analyze the performance of the personalization that I've put together here. So to see the reports, I go back to my dashboard here. I've got a test here that I've created already called homepage banner targeting, which I can look at. So I can start to look at some of the reports for that. So I start by just looking at the summary, get an overview of how this content targeting is going. I can see all the different metrics being tracked here, so I can see that we're tracking conversion, engagement and revenue for these experiences. And I can look at the conversion report of detail behind this, just to see which segments are performing and which ones are outperforming the default experience that I have. Now that gives me great insight into how this test is performing and which variants are beating the default. I've got some content in here, particularly these experiences down here for towels and accessories, which are not performing very well compared to the rotating banner actually. So obviously I've got some issues with some of the content that I'm serving as personalization there. So these messages are not working particularly. However, these two bits of targeted content in here, they are outperforming the default page. So I know I'm being successful with some of the targeting that I'm putting in place there. Now that's good in that lets me understand how this is performing from a testing point of view, and as we discussed earlier, this is about verifying that the segments are correct and seeing that things are performing as we expected. Sometimes though we don't know what the rules are and we don't have any idea of what data we need to use to target people, so maybe we need some tools here to help us understand what the segments are. So in that scenario, what we might do is build the test or build the personalization just as I did before, but not put any rules in place, and just have Maxymiser serve that content randomly across the visitors, and then use the tools here to then analyze the data after the test So this is the post-test reporting that I discussed to show how those different segments are performing after the test has happened. So this is an example of the kind of report we might get out of the system here. Exactly that scenario. There's some personalization campaign here which is serving content randomly. It shows me what increase in conversion we've had by serving that content randomly. So there has been an uplift just by serving content. And what Maxymiser has done is it's found one piece of content which works best overall for all visitors. So we've treated it like a test. We found a kind of winning homepage banner for this. But actually what we've done then is we've analyzed the data under the covers, and we found actually there are multiple segments in that data. So if we look a bit further down here, we can see that within that test data, or that personalization data, there's a segment of people here, represents almost 31% of the traffic. These people come in direct, they haven't visited in the last 2 weeks, they respond best to this kind of content. There's another group of guys down here though, so 13.5% of the traffic. This is the traffic that comes in from an external referrer, and actually they respond better to a different piece of content. So what we've done here is we've discovered the rules that we need to have in place in order to serve the right content to the right people. So if you like, we've identified those clusters. So going back to the presentation before when we talked about the pre-test analysis and the post-test analysis, this is that post-test phase, where we're looking at the performance of the content and then looking for additional micro-segmentation in there to help us maybe refine the personalization we use or be more targeted with the content that we provide. Now, once we've identified these segments, there's a couple of different things we can do. So Maxymiser can take these rules and apply them automatically to the test. So it takes something that was a test and turns it into a personalization layer on top of your website by effectively automatically creating the rules for you. Or you could just take this information away and think about how you might apply that maybe to a permanent part of the platform. I think the key here though is that because you quite often don't know what you're looking for, any of the segment information that appears in here will be based on all of that data we discussed earlier on as well. So it'll be based on not just on the session data and the traffic source and things that are showing up in here, but it'll also be based on all of that form data that we collect, all of the other custom data that we use, and any other data attributes that we collect as part of this data gathering process will be considered in here. And if they are relevant, or if they are indicative of segments or clusters of people, then they will be shown in this report here. Now obviously what you do with this information depends on what you're trying to do. As I say, you can use Maxymiser as a personalization layer from this, or you could take that learning back inside house and use your own content management platform to serve that. Now we've been through the whole process now of considering how we get ourselves set up, what we need to think about and have in place in order for this to be effective and for us to be ready for this. We've looked at the technology and the tools and how you can physically build these things very easily and how you can measure the performance of these. In order to do this properly, the other key part of this is to make sure that organizationally that you're ready for this and that you're set up in the right way to get the maximum value out of it. So there are 3 things that really you need to consider as an organization to make sure that this happens properly. The first one is clear ownership. Regardless of how you deliver personalization, whether it's something that you do completely in-house using Maxymiser technology and nothing else, or whether you take consultancy or services from Maxymiser or from anyone else, unless there's a clear owner inside the organization, this is never really going to be effective. We've also got to make sure that other people in the business are bought into the process, that you're adding value here. And this really comes down, I think, to the demonstrating value, the reporting and insight that you get out of being able to test things effectively and get true statistical data on whether or not this is working for you. That will help you then to get people in the organization to buy into the fact that this is a valuable thing to do and a useful exercise to go through. And it also needs people. You've got to have resource available to be able to do this kind of thing. If you want to do this kind of thing yourself, then you've got to have the resource. You've got to be people who can create the assets, whatever imagery you might need, or the offers, or the component pieces of the website. Potentially there's JavaScript involved in coding, maybe some complex MVT personalization. All those pieces have to be in place, and all that has to be ready. And you have to be able to deliver that effectively in order to get a personalization strategy up and running. And I think the key takeaways though for this are that to be successful with personalization, this is about using data to deliver experiences into your users' sessions. Now, whether you're using rules or whether you're using machine learning, it's still about taking the data and either having yourself or technology understand what content needs to be served. You've got to think about personalization as more than just banners on a home page. I know that's what I showed in the demo, but you've got to think bigger than that. It's got to be about providing people with relevant journeys and relevant experiences. It's got to be about personalizing multiple pages, and not necessarily just personalizing content on multiple pages, potentially serving people different experiences and different journeys. In the airline example that I used, to make sure that people can actually get a relevant experience which works for them and delivers them the service that they need. And then you've got to test absolutely everything you do, because you've got to be able to measure it and you've got to be able to prove that it's working. And unless you can really show that what you're doing is adding value, you're not going to get buy-in from the rest of the organization, and you're not going to be able to kind of move forward because you're not really showing that you're adding any value to anything. So it's got to be tested, it's got to be measured, it's got to be treated as a scientific exercise. And I think that the key to this, the final key, this has just got to be part of the fabric of your organization. You've got to just consider this to be business as usual. It shouldn't be anything special or considered to be a sort of bolt-on on the side or an extra thing that you do outside of the normal scope of activity. It's got to just be business as usual, and you've got to have that culture in there of using data to drive the experience you deliver to your visitors on the website.